Tonight's story is about a wife who found a hotel receipt for a weekend her husband swore was just fishing with an old friend, and the 60-day condition she gave him instead of a screaming match. This is Still Waters. Here's what she wrote. My husband spent President's Day weekend at a lake cabin with a woman he once called nothing serious. The weekend didn't end my marriage. 4 words did. The 4 words he said when I finally asked him why the reservation had both their names on it, 3 weeks before he ever mentioned the trip existed. I'm Elena. I'm 34. I've worked as a physical therapist for 9 years, mostly with post-surgical patients, which means my whole professional life is built around one idea. Healing takes longer than people want it to, and you can't rush a joint back into place just because you're impatient with the timeline. I mention that because I spent a long time trying to apply the same patience to my marriage, and it took me most of a year to understand that a person isn't a shoulder. Some things don't get better just because you keep showing up to work on them alone. Marcus and I had been married 6 years. He's an ER nurse, 36, the kind of calm under pressure that made me feel safe the first year we dated, when I watched him talk down an agitated patient in a hallway without raising his voice once. That steadiness was the whole reason I married him. It's also, I'd learned, the exact quality that let him sit across from me at dinner for 4 months and never once look like a man who was lying. It started, as far as I can trace it, at his nursing school reunion in April 14 months ago. Bree had been his girlfriend for 2 years, back in nursing school, before me, and they'd stayed loosely in touch the way people do. A like on a photo, a comment every few months. At the reunion, they ended up at the same table. Marcus mentioned it to me that night, casually, over takeout. Bree was there. She's living in Charlotte now, doing pediatric ICU. Wild seeing her again. I said that was nice. I meant it. I didn't think about it again for weeks. I want to walk you through how slowly this actually moved, because that's the part people leave out when they tell these stories. It wasn't an affair that started with a bang. It was a text thread that got a little longer every month. By June, Marcus mentioned her maybe once every couple weeks. A meme she'd sent, a patient story she'd shared that made him laugh. By September, I noticed he'd started taking his phone into the bathroom when it buzzed at dinner, which he'd never done in 6 years of marriage. I asked him about it once, lightly. Is everything okay with your phone? He said, yeah, work group chat's just been busy. And I let it go, because I didn't have a single concrete reason not to. I didn't know yet that I'd already started counting. I just hadn't decided, consciously, to keep the number. By December, I'd stopped being able to name what was bothering me, which is its own kind of warning sign. Nothing was wrong exactly. He still came to my sister's birthday dinner. Still remembered to defrost the chicken on Tuesdays. Still kissed me goodbye every morning at 6:40 before his shift. But there was a specific quality to how he held his phone now. Angled slightly away from me on the couch, that I'd started registering the way you register a change in air pressure before a storm you can't yet see. I didn't have a name for what I was feeling yet. In 4 months, I would. In late January, he told me Bree was coming through Virginia for a continuing education conference in Richmond, and that she wanted to get away afterward for a weekend, just to catch up properly, maybe drive out to the lake. The cabin he meant was the one his family used to rent every summer growing up, 40 minutes outside Charlottesville, a place I'd been to exactly twice in 6 years, both times with him. It's just as friends, he said. You'd probably find it boring anyway. All our old nursing school stories. I remember searching his face for something, and not finding it, because he genuinely didn't look like a man hiding anything. That's what made it worse later. He wasn't a bad liar. He simply, by then, didn't think of it as lying. I said okay, and here's the actual reason why. Because it matters. I didn't say okay because I trusted the plan. I said okay because I didn't yet have a fact to argue with. Only a feeling. And I'd spent 34 years being taught that a feeling without a fact doesn't count as evidence of anything. The fact arrived by accident, the way most of these things do. 10 days before the trip, I was going through our joint credit card statement to reconcile it against our tax folder. A Sunday afternoon task I do every quarter, nothing dramatic about it. And found a charge from a cabin rental company in Nelson County, dated 3 weeks earlier, for $612, under a reservation name that read Marcus and Bree. Not Marcus, not Marcus plus guest. Both names spelled out on a booking made 3 full weeks, before he'd said a single word to me about any trip at all. I sat with that receipt for a long time before I did anything about it. I didn't call him at work. I didn't text an accusation. I did what 9 years of physical therapy had trained me to do with any injury. I documented it first, and I waited to see the full range of the damage before deciding on treatment. I screenshotted the statement. I checked our shared calendar and found the trip only appeared on it 4 days after the booking date. I looked at his phone bill, which I have access to but almost never open, and counted the texts to one number over the preceding 90 days. 214. Not messages I could read the content of, just the count, the shape of the thing. 214 texts to a woman he described to me as someone he saw once a year at a reunion. I didn't say anything before he left for the weekend. I want to explain that choice, because a lot of people would have stopped him at the door. I didn't, because I needed to know what he'd say when there was nothing left to hide behind, and the only way to get an honest answer was to let him believe he still had one more day of not having to give it. He texted twice that weekend. Saturday morning, made it, weather's nice, talk later. Sunday afternoon, after I asked directly how the drive back was going. Good, just packing up now, home by 8. Both messages were short in a way that felt engineered. The kind of short you write when you're being careful rather than busy. I didn't push. I made dinner. I put the receipt in a folder on the kitchen counter, face down, and waited for him to walk in the door. He got home at 8:20, tired in a way that looked real, and kissed my forehead before he'd even set his bag down. "Good trip?" I asked. "Yeah, good to catch up," he said. "Nothing crazy, just talked a lot." I asked him then, straight out, when the cabin had actually been booked. He paused. It was a small pause, maybe 2 seconds, but I'd spent 6 years learning his face, and I watched him do the math on what I might already know before he answered. "A few weeks ago, I think." "Why?" I put the folder on the counter between us and slid it towards him. He opened it, read the date on the printout, and I watched something in his shoulders drop. "You booked this with her 3 weeks before you told me it existed," I said. My voice wasn't loud. I'd promised myself, sitting with that receipt for 10 days, that I wasn't going to raise it, because raising my voice would let this become a fight about tone instead of a conversation about what actually happened. "It's not what it looks like," he said. "We were just figuring out logistics for her conference. It made sense to book early. Prices go up." "Marcus." I said his name once, flatly, and he stopped. "I'm not asking about the price of the cabin. I'm asking why you let me believe this trip was your idea, spur of the moment, when you'd already reserved it under both your names before you ever said her name to me that month." He didn't answer that directly. Instead, he said, Nothing happened up there. I swear to you, nothing physical happened. And there it was, the same 4 words I'd been bracing for since I found the receipt. The ones that told me everything about what he thought this conversation was actually about. Dosetina stirred. I know nothing physical happened, I said, and I meant it. I believed him on that specific point, then and now. That was never the question I was asking. The question is, why a man who wasn't doing anything wrong needed to keep the booking a secret for 3 weeks. He didn't have an answer for that. I watched him try to build one anyway. I didn't think you'd understand. Then, I didn't want you to make it weird. Then, finally quieter, I think I liked that it was mine. Something that wasn't about the house or the schedule or being on call. I didn't think about what that meant for you. That last sentence was the only honest one in the whole conversation, and it was also the one that told me how long this had actually been building, underneath the version of events I'd been getting in small, manageable pieces since April. I told him I needed him to hear the actual shape of what he'd done, laid out plainly, because I didn't think he'd absorbed it yet through the individual pieces. 214 texts in 90 days to a woman he described to me as a reunion acquaintance. A cabin booked under both their names 3 weeks before he mentioned it. A weekend of short, careful replies that read like a man managing what his wife could see rather than a man with nothing to manage. None of those things, on their own, proved an affair. All of them together proved a second relationship, running quietly alongside our marriage, one he'd been tending for months, while I tended the version he let me see. I didn't know yet how much of that number would end up mattering. I only knew, standing in my own kitchen, that I couldn't unknow it. He asked what I wanted to do. I told him I didn't know yet, and that I wasn't going to decide anything that night, because I'd already made the mistake once this year of making a decision to say okay to the trip, based on a feeling I hadn't let myself trust. I wasn't going to correct that by making the next decision too fast either. I took 4 days before I gave him my answer. Those 4 days looked less dramatic than people probably expect. I went to work. I saw 17 patients across those 4 days, none of whom knew anything was wrong at home, and I noticed more than once how strange it was to spend an hour telling someone else exactly how much weight to put on a healing joint, while I had no idea yet how much weight my own marriage could actually hold. On the 5th day, I told Marcus what I needed. 60 days apart, he'd move into his brother Dean's spare room, 40 minutes away. No contact with Bree during that window, which I told him I couldn't verify, but was asking for anyway. Because at some point, trust has to be a choice someone makes without a monitor standing over them. Weekly counseling together, with a therapist I'd already found and booked an intake session with, before I ever said any of this out loud. And at the end of the 60 days, an honest conversation about whether what he'd built with her over those 14 months was actually over, or whether it had just been paused for my benefit. I didn't know yet that only 31 of those 60 days would end up counting for anything. He agreed to all of it faster than I expected, which I noticed and didn't fully trust, because agreeing fast is easy when nothing has been asked of you yet. The first 3 weeks went the way you'd hope. He texted me nightly, ordinary things, how his shift went, whether I'd eaten. We saw the counselor on Thursdays. I started, cautiously, to let myself imagine the version of this, where 60 days actually fixed something. I let myself believe that for exactly 1 more week. In the 4th week, Dean mentioned, without realizing it was information, that Marcus had left for a work thing in Richmond one Saturday and hadn't said much about it after. I didn't ask Marcus directly. I called the hospital's scheduling line the following Monday, gave my name as his wife, checking a shift swap, and confirmed there had been no work event, no conference, nothing on the calendar that Saturday at all. I didn't confront him with that the way I had with the receipt. I sat with it for 2 more days, the way I'd trained myself to, and I understood, somewhere in that waiting, that I already knew what I was going to do before I let myself say it out loud. I told him on a Tuesday evening, sitting across from him at the same kitchen table where I'd first slid that folder toward him, that I knew about the Saturday. I didn't ask him where he'd gone or with whom, because at that point the specific answer didn't change what the pattern already told me. He tried to explain that it was one lunch, that nothing happened, that same 4 words again, and I finally understood that he genuinely believed nothing physical happened, was a complete defense, a whole accounting of the harm, when it had never once been the ledger I was keeping. I told him the 60 days were over on my end, 31 days early. Not because one lunch was worse than everything before it, but because it confirmed the one thing I'd been quietly hoping I was wrong about, that the secrecy wasn't a symptom of a bad month. It was the actual shape of how he decided to handle wanting something he knew I wouldn't approve of. Ask forgiveness? Never. Ask permission? Never. Just keep the parts I couldn't see running underneath the parts I could. He cried at the table, and I believe it was real. I told him I believed that too, and that it didn't change my answer. I filed the paperwork 6 weeks later. It wasn't a courtroom moment. No lawyer showing up at a cabin door. Nothing that dramatic. Just a folder of documents at a lawyer's office 19 minutes from the house we used to share. And a signature that took less time than I expected. Something that large to take. Marcus reached out twice in the months after, both times to say he understood, that he wasn't angry at the decision, that he wished he'd told me about the booking the day he made it instead of 3 weeks later. I believe that regret is real too. It doesn't change the math. There was a version of that spring where he told me about Bree's visit the same day he booked the cabin. And I think, honestly, I might have said yes to the trip anyway. What I couldn't survive wasn't the friendship. It was finding out, one bank statement at a time, how much of my own marriage I'd been receiving in edited form. I still work with healing joints for a living, still tell patients every week that recovery isn't linear, that some setbacks don't mean the whole treatment failed. I believe that completely about shoulders and knees. I'm still working out how much of it applies to trust, and whether trust, once it's been rebuilt from a receipt instead of a conversation, ever quite bears weight the same way again. So here's what I keep wondering. How do you tell the difference between a person protecting something private and a person protecting something they already know you'd say no to? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. That's the whole story. If this one stayed with you, subscribe to Still Waters. Thanks for listening.